John's workplace, and the reason for our living in Sennin, was a mile or two out of the village on the Porthcurno road. Royal Air Force Sennin was built on the site of Skewjack Farm by the RAF in 1940, as the RAF Regiment Barracks for the Greater Chain Station CH-17. After they were married, for a few months Brenda and John lived with his father in Wolverhampton, Brenda later moving back in with Lena and Angus, until such time as John could find work in Cornwall. But in June 1949, with Brenda pregnant, John applied for a job at Skewjack, and in September he began work as radio mechanic class 1 at number 428 Signals Unit, RAF Sennin. He worked there throughout the 1950s, becoming a radio telecommunications technical officer grade 3, and his responsibilities, as far as I'm aware, involved monitoring and identifying whatever flew overhead, and keeping the machinery in good order. There were usually 2 men on duty, and it was shift work, allowing the station to be manned at all times. The site had a couple of 360-foot-high link aerial radar masts, which, along with all the other machinery, required regular maintenance. On August the 4th, 1968, John and his mate Charlie Jollo set off to clean the machinery at the top of the tower, a regular task, and as usual, Charlie switched off the machinery at the bottom of the mast. John began the hair-raising climb to the top, and Charlie went back to the hut to carry on with the cleaning. From experience, John knew that by the time he reached the top, the motor drive would have had time to slow down and stop. Maybe he climbed a little quicker that day, as on this occasion, on reaching the top, he removed the canvas cover and the inspection panel and reached inside the awkward space with the rag in his hand to begin the cleaning. But the heavy gears hadn't quite finished rotating and were on their last turn. His rag was caught and his hand pulled into the works, severing one fingertip and smashing several others. He was trapped 360 feet up in the air, precariously balanced on a small metal platform, losing blood and in great pain, and his co-worker, the hard-of-hearing Charlie Jollo, was in the Nissen hut a little way away. He screamed for Charlie, who thankfully appeared a few minutes later and climbed the mast. But even with John's feeble attempts to help unbolt the mechanism, they couldn't release his hand. Charlie had to leave John there to climb down to phone for help, and eventually John's boss, Mr. Bradley, arrived, and between the 3 of them, all at the top of the tower, they at last managed to release John. He later said he couldn't remember much about it. He knew he couldn't faint, as he would likely have slipped and could have fallen and lost his hand or worse. Amazingly, he then managed to climb back down the tower and was taken to Penzance Hospital in Mr. Bradley's car and eventually to Treliske Hospital around 40 miles away. He arrived there some 4 hours after the accident, at last received his first pain-killing injection, and his hand was operated on. I dread to think what he must have gone through. By the time Brenda and I got up to Treliske a few hours later, he was white as a sheet and still in shock. Thankfully, apart from losing the tip of his forefinger, which gave him endless amusement later pretending to pick his nose, his other fingers all healed, though they bore scars, and he was not seriously disabled. John was also a member of the Royal Observer Corps and RAYNET, the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network, and sometimes went on training exercises with a civil defence theme, usually incorporating all the different services, military and civil. He took part in a few of these, often 2-day affairs involving many volunteers, some grotesquely wounded, playing out a nightmare scenario of nuclear or other attack or natural disaster. Some years after we left Senin, he had the opportunity to go up to the Shetland Islands on an aircraft recognition refresher course. He was put in the nose of a Shackleton aircraft and taken up on a routine training flight. The weather was none too clear, I believe. Sometime into the flight, he spotted another aircraft, seemingly on a collision course with his own plane, and fearing that his pilot hadn't seen this potential danger, alerted him. The pilot, a rather well-spoken RAF chappie, responded briskly with, "Oh, good show, Nose!" Father gleefully told us this story on his return home, and forever after we were able to taunt him for all his small achievements with cries of, "Good show, Nose!" particularly when he was pretending to pick it with his shortened forefinger.